Hey everybody, welcome back. This is a continuation of the lesson from IB Global Politics Unit 4 on peace and conflict. And today we're going to be talking about theoretical models. In particular, one theoretical model we're going to analyze closely. So let's talk about what is a theoretical model supposed to do? Well, we're going to kind of create a general graph or a kind of description that could be used to understand various conflicts. And that's essentially what a theoretical model tries to do, is to create a general description that would apply to various examples. And in doing so, we're going to be able to understand common causes and the underlying prerequisite generalities that can be used to describe conflicts. So there are going to be different interpretations of what those underlying generalities are, and that's how we can kind of compare models to each other. So they should help us to diagnose various things about a conflict: the severity of the conflict, the time frame, how far into it is, are there possible solutions, what possible solutions are those? And they can be very, very helpful in that way. So what I want you to try to do today is to look at the model that we're going to discuss today a little bit and try to use it to explain relations that we might have with North Korea or Russia, or internal conflicts that happen, like with Syria, or maybe these kind of cross-border proxy conflicts like we've seen with the Israel, Saudi, Iran kind of axis of conflict that has in part caused the Yemen war. So let's try to use the theoretical models to inform ourselves and be able to explain something about conflicts that are currently ongoing. All right, so today we're going to look at the model of R.J. Rummel. He is a political scientist from the University of Hawaii, and in the late 80s, I believe, or maybe the early 90s, he innovated a model that was called the conflict helix model. And I found that this is a pretty useful kind of tool to help describe an interpretation of how conflict happens. And I think what it tries to show is that democracy is really the preferred system, because he's going to assume that conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen no matter what, and that every nation and every kind of region goes through periods of this kind of inevitable conflict. And therefore, he thinks that it's through democracies and through kinds of social contractual agreements that we find the most likely path towards peace. So this is the illustration of the model. And obviously it looks a little bit complex, but I want you to notice a few different features. So first of all, the axis here is describing a state of peace and learning. So down lower is going to be a state of conflict and war, and up towards a higher degree, as the line moves higher, it's moving towards peace. And the other axis is just time passing. These squiggly lines indicate conflict behavior. Okay? And the straight lines indicate when expectations are now being met by society. So here's kind of the general thesis. Society goes through conflict, arrives at agreements where there are expectations being met about how to resolve that conflict. But over the course of time, the structure of expectation starts to change, and there becomes a gap between the expectations and the balance of powers. And that's when you start to lead to conflict. Now, you can also get situations where there's a radical change in the conditions or the state of a conflict relationship. Like there's a global pandemic. That's a radical change where now all of a sudden expectations aren't being met. People are scared. There's no meat in the stores. The supply chain isn't met. There's 30 million people unemployed. We expect more from our government. We need them to help. We need them to bail out the states. We need them to give checks. We demand these things. And if people feel like the government aren't meeting those new expectations, they're going to be angry. and it's going to lead to conflict behavior. Occasionally, you will see a society that moves up towards cooperation and peace and towards learning, but there's some radical change in conditions. Maybe it's a global pandemic, maybe it's some kind of massive natural disaster or resource shortage can often trigger something like this. The fresh water supplies dries up, and then you see huge extreme conflict behavior where all that peace and learning now deteriorates. Okay. So the way he describes it is you can look at it kind of like a helical structure. It goes in this kind of circular structure where society moves up in this kind of spiral towards more peace, and then there's more conflict, and then there's more peace, and then there's more conflict, and there's more peace. But then, of course, that coil can be sheared, and it can lead to the cycle kind of repeating itself. So let's break this down in a little bit more detail. First of all, Rummel's theory clearly reflects the understanding of peace as a balance of power. So this is not necessarily an inner peace, although he is going to try to address the notion of individual peace with this theory as well. But the big vocabulary term that I would have you understand to really flush out what the conflict helix is all about is the idea of the gap principle. So a gap between expectations and the power to actually fulfill those expectations causes conflict. You can think of this on a micro level. If there's something that you really need from your family and they're providing it for you and then suddenly they stop providing it for you, it's going to be a problem. Or there's something you really need and there's just a huge gap between what your family can provide and what you need, there's going to be conflict about it. You could look at this in a company, in a business. You could look at this in government or between countries. That is the general theoretical model that applies to all these different conflicts, right? So, a quote from the text that you're going to be assigned to read that illustrates this. Excuse me. Conflict and cooperation, therefore, are interdependent. They are alternative phases in a continuous social process underlying human interaction. Now conflict, then cooperation, and then again conflict. Cooperation involves a harmony of expectations congruent with a balance of powers achieved by conflict. Can you start to see maybe, stop and predict for a second, can you start to see maybe why he would think that democracies would be the best way to actually achieve this kind of cooperation? Hopefully that should be somewhat evident. So, he's going to argue that peace only happens when a social contract happens, and that the expectations of that social contract are being reasonably met. Hence, countries that have institutions like criminal justice institutions that people feel somewhat confident in, like it's not just a matter of bribing the police or bribing the judge, that there actually are institutions that actually do provide some degree of due process and criminal justice, then people aren't going to be upset about that. But if they feel like the system is wronging them and it is rigged and those institutions are corrupt, it's going to lead to conflict and anger. So therefore, keeping the peace then depends most generally on maintaining congruence between the balance of powers and the structure of expectations, which is the social contract. You might call that our Constitution in the United States. This might be done by altering expectations unilaterally to adjust to changing capabilities like executive orders and trying to actually reframe what people should expect during a pandemic crisis, something like that, acting unilaterally, or strengthening will to lessen a developing gap with expectations. So that means that governments and political actors, if they want to reduce conflict, have to try to reduce the gap between what people expect and what they're really getting. Okay, so he says that there are a lot of different notions of peace and conflict and contracts, and that these can apply in various situations, like I said, from that micro local level, that personal level, all the way up through the regional to the national to the international to the global level. And he says that the reason that democracies are better is because people can more freely express themselves and be active in shaping the social contract. And when you have that stake in the contract, it's not only going to lead to a more reasonable expectation structure, but it's also going to account for that kind of internal piece of individuals. Because when we feel like we have some control over our social situation, and when we feel like we have some freedom and liberty, we're going to feel more at peace. Now, this is something that maybe Rummel might be criticized for. I've seen people say that he's perhaps approaching this from a kind of Eurocentric, classical liberal perspective here. And maybe he is not necessarily as sensitive to how other cultures might see this. But I'm going to ask you guys to read this for yourselves. And of course, I want to hear your thoughts about this, about how this applies to current conflicts, and whether you think he's right, that his kind of diagnosis and his solution is to try to push the world towards more democratic ideals. So, the assignment will be to actually read the text and to annotate it, to highlight the important text, and answer the questions at the end of the document. Of course, you could insert little comments, however you like to do annotations. You guys know what we've talked about with annotations earlier in the year. And then answer the questions at the end of the document. So this will count basically for 3 homework assignments. So I'll give you some time to do this, but there is going to be one more reading in this unit, and we'll get to that next time. Take care, everybody. I hope you're all safe and well.